The Grand Priest had witnessed the birth of 14 universes and the quiet, clinical erasure of 6 others. He had watched the flow of time like an ancient gardener watches a shallow, predictable stream, unbothered, eternal, and entirely detached. He was a being of pure, unshakable composure, a pillar of divine logic, who had never once, in all the eons of his existence, found a reason to cover his eyes in genuine apprehension. Until today. Today, the very fabric of the null realm was undergoing a molecular crystallization that defied the very laws of celestial physics. The infinite pressurized canvas, where the tournament of power had once roared with the heat of a billion souls, was no longer an empty void. It was becoming a solid, suffocating tomb of transparent, jagged glass. I stood trembling behind the massive etched pillars of the spectator dais, watching as my own divine essence flickered like a dying candle caught in a cosmic gale. Standing at the center of this gathering storm was the Father, a primordial entity whose true name had been struck from the Akashic records long before the first Xeno was even a thought. His armor was a terrifying sight to behold. It was forged from the hyper-compressed cores of 10,000 dying suns. It pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light that seemed to dictate the very heartbeat of reality itself, forcing every living thing to breathe in time with his will. And there, standing before this architect of the end, was the mortal. But as I gazed upon Son Goku, I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that the word mortal had become a linguistic relic. It was a term that no longer applied to the entity he was becoming in this suffocating silence. The air had turned into a substance denser than industrial diamond, grinding against our skin with the weight of a collapsing galaxy. The silence following Goku's last ragged breath was heavier, more oppressive, and far louder than any supernova explosion I had ever heard. We were currently positioned in the deepest, most forgotten basement of creation. This was a subdimension where the concepts of up and down were merely vague, forgotten suggestions. This was the correction arc, a catastrophic event the angels had only ever whispered about in hushed, terrified tones during the transition of eras. The Father had returned from the great outside to reclaim the sparks of life he had scattered across the cosmos. He had deemed the current multiverse a messy, emotional, and ultimately failed experiment that required immediate deletion. Goku had already tried every weapon in his arsenal, pushing his body past the point of structural integrity. We watched him burn through the golden, searing heat of Super Saiyan Blue, only for it to be snuffed out like a damp match in a hurricane. We watched him ascend to the silver-haired grace of Ultra Instinct, but even the pinnacle of godhood was insufficient against the first architect. The Father had simply reached out with a casual, bored movement and caught Goku's maximum power punch with 2 fingers. The impact of that single, effortless block made the Saiyan's bones ring like cracked, rusted bells, echoing through the empty stadium for an eternity. The Father's power wasn't just higher than Goku's. It was foundational, the very math upon which strength was calculated. He was the wall that all logic and all kinetic force eventually crashed against and died. Goku now lay in the gray dust of a shattered floating island, his key signature flatlining into a terrifying horizontal void. His presence was fading into the background radiation of the null realm, becoming nothing more than a memory. We thought it was over, the final chapter written in the ink of our own extinction. Beerus had already lowered his head in a rare moment of total submission, accepting the inevitable erasure of Universe 7. But then, the temperature didn't just drop. It ceased to exist entirely. The first anomaly was subtle, a trick of the light that none of the gathered deities could rationally explain. Usually, when a Saiyan powers up, the environment reacts with a predictable, violent choreography of destruction. Rocks float, lightning strikes, and the ground shatters under the weight of the atmospheric pressure. But as Goku slowly stood up, the rubble around him didn't move an inch. It froze. I don't mean it turned to ice in the traditional elemental sense. I mean, it literally stopped moving within the flow of time. A jagged pebble caught in midair stayed there, suspended. Not because of telekinesis, but because every single ounce of kinetic energy within its atoms had been drained. Goku's breath didn't come out as a white mist in the cold. It fell to the floor as solid, crystalline oxygen shards, clinking against the void matter like fragments of broken glass. Whis stepped forward, his divine staff vibrating with a high-pitched morning whine that set our teeth on edge. "His heart," Whis whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual melodic, teasing playfulness. "It isn't beating, my lord. It has stopped. He is bypassing the biological necessity of life to maintain a state of perfect, absolute thermal stasis." Goku's aura didn't flare upward in the usual roar of ki fire or the flickering flames of a god. Instead, it flowed downward, a heavy, translucent liquid mercury that coated the invisible floor of the arena. It spread out in a radius that turned the dark void into a shimmering, frozen mirror that reflected the terror on our faces. The pattern of escalation began to defy every law of key physics we had spent eons cataloging and teaching. The Father, sensing a fundamental shift in the atmosphere, unleashed a wave of primordial erasure. This was a beam of pure, blinding white energy, designed to unmake whatever it touched at a conceptual, spiritual level. In any other fight, Goku would have dodged with the speed of light or countered with a desperate, screaming Kamehameha. Instead, he simply walked forward with a rhythmic, haunting gait. As the erasure beam hit the perimeter of Goku's new absolute zero field, the energy didn't explode or dissipate. It slowed down to a crawl. It turned from a beam of light into a jagged, physical pillar of white glass that hummed with a dead frequency. Goku shattered the divine attack by simply brushing his shoulder against it as he passed. Each step the Saiyan took left a glowing, frost-bitten footprint on the nothingness of the void. The gods in the stands were all standing now, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the realization of their own irrelevance. Champa dropped his goblet of nectar, and the purple liquid froze into a solid, jagged spike before it could even hit the ground. We finally realized the terrifying truth of the absolute zero form. Goku wasn't generating power anymore. He was removing it from the universe. He was creating a localized heat death, a vacuum of energy so profound that even the Father's divine attacks were being robbed of their ability to exist. The Father tried to strike with a physical blow, but his arm moved as if through thick, freezing syrup. The very concept of speed was being stolen from his limbs, leaving him sluggish and vulnerable. "This is the point of no return," the Grand Priest murmured, his voice trembling with a look that bordered on religious awe. "He has accessed the frequency of the first dragon, the one who slept in the primordial frost before the first star was ever lit." As if answering the priest's words, a towering, terrifying silhouette began to rise from the mercury-like aura behind Goku. It wasn't the golden shimmer of Shenron, or the red, primal rage of a great ape. It was a serpentine beast, made of black ice and compressed ancient starlight. Its eyes were two dead blue suns, staring out from the beginning of time itself. The absolute zero dragon had awakened. The transformation was so quiet, it was more terrifying than any scream. Goku's hair hadn't just turned white. It had become crystalline and translucent. It reflected the dead stars of the void like a prism of ice, shifting colors with every micro-movement. His eyes were gone, replaced by a flat, matte cerulean that looked like the surface of a frozen ocean at the very end of the world. The Father, for the first time in the history of the written word, hesitated in his stride. He pulled back his fist, his star-forged armor groaning under the sudden, intense contraction of the unnatural cold. The armor, supposed to be the most durable substance in the entire hierarchy of gods, started to spiderweb with thousands of hairline fractures. The tension tightened until it felt like our own souls would snap under the weight of the silence. Goku was now operating in a space where no ally, not even the angels, could follow or assist. Even Whis stayed back, knowing that to enter that field was to have one's very molecular motion ceased instantly and forever. The father, desperate now and sensing his own mortality, tapped into his Big Bang reserves. He attempted to ignite the void with enough heat to restart 1 billion galaxies and boil the very fabric of space. The darkness turned a blinding, searing gold that should have incinerated every observer in the stands. But Goku merely raised a single, calm hand toward the inferno. He didn't shout a name. He didn't roar a battle cry or demand victory. He simply closed his fingers into a tight, decisive fist. The golden light didn't dim. It froze in place. The entire explosion was captured in a snapshot of cosmic ice. A multicolored nebula trapped inside a jagged, frozen sphere of nothingness. The sound of the absolute zero taking hold was a sharp crystalline crack that echoed through the minds of every living being in the multiverse. We were watching a man rewrite the definition of the end in real time. Goku was no longer fighting a battle. He was performing a cold, clinical funeral for the father's ego. The climax arrived with a stillness that was more violent than any impact I had ever witnessed in my long life. Goku moved, and this time, even the high-ranking gods couldn't see the transition or the movement. One moment he was 10 meters away, the next his fist was buried deep in the center of the father's sun-forged chest piece. There was no shockwave. There was no crater. There was only the haunting, delicate sound of shattering glass. The father's armor, the inviolate shell, blew apart into 1 trillion shimmering dust particles that caught the dim light. It didn't break into chunks. It was unmade at the atomic level. Its bonds were frozen and snapped by the absolute zero dragon's touch. The father's eyes widened, a silent, frozen scream escaping his lips as the frost crawled up his neck. It turned his divine essence into a statue of black, lightless diamond. Goku's fist didn't just break the armor. It broke the father's connection to the timeline itself. The impact sent a ripple of cold through the past, present, and future. It momentarily stopped the hearts of every king and pauper across 12 universes. It was the decisive strike. The moment the creator realized he was no longer the most powerful thing in his own creation. When the ice finally began to recede, the father was gone. He was reduced to a lingering mist of subatomic frost that drifted aimlessly into the dark. The void returned to its natural state of nothingness, but it felt different now. It felt heavier, as if the memory of that unnatural cold still lingered in the vacuum like a ghost. Goku stood in the center of the silence, his translucent hair slowly reverting to its messy, ink-black state. He didn't cheer or raise his fist in victory. He didn't turn to us with that familiar, goofy grin that usually signaled the end of a long fight. He simply stood there, staring at his hands, which were still smoking with a faint, blue vapor of absolute zero. The Grand Priest approached, but he stopped 5 full paces away, his hands trembling slightly behind his back. The hierarchy of the multiverse had been shattered as thoroughly as the father's armor. We had won, but the victory felt like a grim, cosmic warning to all who watched. The question that remains, the one that keeps us angels awake in the quiet hours of the night, isn't whether Goku can reach that power again. It's what he left behind of his humanity inside that frozen state. For a few minutes, Son Goku wasn't a hero, a Saiyan, or a friend. He was the absolute zero, the cold truth that even gods must eventually end. And the multiverse will never look at the stars the same way again, knowing how easily and how quietly they can be extinguished.